The Middle Ages were soaked in blood. Wars were merciless, battles relentless, and cruelty was simply a part of it. There were weapons so horrifying and so inhumane that even medieval rulers said, "This must be forbidden, let's take a look at them together." The mace. Let's start with the mace, a weapon that embodied the idea of raw, unfiltered brutality. Unlike swords that cut or arrows that pierced, the mace was designed for only one purpose: to destroy everything it hit. It was a heavy metal club with a spiked head, and when swung with force, it could shatter bones, crush skulls, and dent armor like nothing else. But here's the thing. The mace wasn't just a tool for the battlefield. Over time, it became a symbol of unbridled power. In parts of Germany and Italy, especially in cities where political power struggles spilled onto the streets, the mace appeared in the hands of thugs, private militias, and even corrupt officials. It was easy to use, too deadly in close quarters, and it caused injuries that no surgeon could heal. Eventually, city authorities had to intervene. They recognized that the mace wasn't just a threat on the battlefield, it destabilized urban life itself. So in many cities, particularly in Germany and northern Italy, laws were passed that restricted or completely banned its possession in public spaces. It was simply too dangerous, but you think that's exaggerated. Wait for the next weapon. A blade that turned medieval streets into bloodbaths. The Baselard dagger. Now the Baselard dagger may not look threatening at first glance. It is a large dagger or a short sword with a distinctive hilt, and it was extremely popular in the late Middle Ages, especially among the urban population. But popularity was not always a good thing. This weapon was notorious not on the battlefield but in the back alleys and marketplaces of Europe's growing cities. Street gangs. Political factions and common criminals loved the Baselard because it was easy to hide under a cloak and was deadly when drawn. It was fast, sharp, and turned small disputes into deadly confrontations. The authorities noticed that the number of dead and injured in street fights was skyrocketing, and usually a Baselard dagger was involved. So cities like London, Paris, and several in the Holy Roman Empire began issuing prohibitions or strict regulations that forbade carrying the Baselard within the city walls. It wasn't about disarming knights. It was about preserving the peace in places already on the brink of lawlessness. But of course, while the Baselard ruled the streets, a much greater horror lurked during the war. This brings us to the trebuchet, a weapon so massive and destructive that it changed siege warfare forever. And not always for the better. The trebuchet. When we talk about the trebuchet, we are talking about the absolute king of medieval siege weapons. This was not a typical catapult, it was a technical marvel that could hurl massive stones, heavy debris, and sometimes even entire tree trunks over city walls with terrifying precision and force. But here it crossed the line into horror. Eventually, armies realized that they could weaponize not just stones, but also disease. They began loading the trebuchet with the decaying carcasses of animals and even plague-infected human bodies, and hurling them over the castle walls. The idea was simple: spread death before you even set foot inside. This tactic was so cruel and indiscriminate that religious authorities, including the church, condemned it. Some rulers followed suit and completely banned this type of siege because it blurred the already infamous lines between war and genocide. But while the trebuchet was a machine of distant destruction in close combat, things became much more personal and much scarier. The Morning Star. The Morning Star is one of those weapons that seems to come straight out of a nightmare. It is essentially a club, but with a deadly twist. At the end of the shaft is a massive metal ball covered with sharp, nasty spikes. A single blow with this thing and you didn't just knock someone unconscious. You tore flesh, broke bones, and pierced straight through armor, and it wasn't just a tool of war. The Morning Star also found its way into the darker corners of society, torture chambers, and public executions. It became a symbol of cruelty, not just military strength. Some regions and authorities started paying attention, especially when it was used for more than just battlefield encounters. The injuries it caused were so horrific and the deaths so protracted that it was eventually banned or strictly regulated in parts of Europe, particularly when used in civil punishments and spectacles. But the desire for brutal close combat weapons didn't end there. If the Morning Star was a symbol of raw power, the flail was the chaos that no one could control. The war flail. If you have ever seen a war flail, you understand why it terrified both the enemy and the user himself. It is a weapon that looks almost impossible to master, a wooden handle connected by a chain to a spiked metal ball. The chain meant that the ball could be swung with incredible speed and unpredictability, bypassing shields and shattering armor. But it was this very unpredictability that made it dangerous for everyone, including the one wielding it. There are countless reports of soldiers injuring themselves or their comrades because the flail's trajectory was so difficult to control in the chaos of battle. And beyond the battlefield, the war flail gained a darker reputation during peasant revolts. Peasants who lacked formal training turned agricultural tools into improvised war flails and thus into instruments of rebellion. This connection to social unrest made the city authorities nervous. Some cities completely banned the weapon, not only because of its chaos on the battlefield, but also because of its role in arming the lower classes during uprisings. But as powerful and impetuous as the war flail was, it was not the only weapon that sent chills down the authorities' spines. The next weapon was so feared that even the church intervened to ban it. But before we continue, if you have enjoyed the video so far, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That helps us post even more videos like this. Thank you. The crossbow. The crossbow changed warfare forever. Unlike longbows, which required years of training and strength, the crossbow was a deadly equalizer. A peasant with minimal training could kill a knight with one shot. That terrified the nobility because suddenly their expensive armor and elevated status didn't mean much against a bolt flying with deadly speed. The church saw it the same way. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council declared the crossbow too cruel to be used in conflicts between Christians. It wasn't just about the physical devastation. It was about how easily it shifted the balance of power on the battlefield. The idea that common soldiers could kill nobility so easily was seen as a threat to the social order itself. Of course, this ban didn't completely stop its use, far from it, but it showed how unsettling this weapon was to the authorities of the time. And while the crossbow redefined ranged combat in close combat, there were weapons designed only to mutilate and humiliate. The war scythe. Let's talk about the war scythe now. And no, this was not a weapon made by skilled smiths for noble knights. It was a symbol of desperation, transformed into destruction. The war scythe was originally just an agricultural tool, a curved blade meant for harvesting grain, but in the hands of revolting peasants, it became something much more dangerous. When peasants had had enough of oppression and taxes, they didn't have swords or armor, but they had tools, and the scythe, when reforged and mounted upright on a long shaft, turned into a vicious polearm that could cut through flesh, muscle, and even bone in a wide, sweeping motion. It could take down cavalrymen, rip soldiers from their horses, and cause absolute panic among trained forces who were not prepared to face an angry mob with such deadly tools. Rulers quickly recognized this. The war scythe was banned in several regions, especially in areas prone to uprisings. Because it wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of rebellion. Allowing peasants to arm themselves with something so deadly was seen as a direct threat to the existing order. And if you think the war scythe was terrifying in the hands of the poor, imagine what trained warriors could do with a shield designed not just for defense, but for killing. The spiked shield. The shield has always been a soldier's best friend, a wall against flying arrows, swords, and axes. But some warriors were not content just to ward off attacks. They turned their shields into weapons themselves, thus the spiked shield was born. a brutal innovation where the front of the shield was fitted with deadly spikes, sometimes even blades. Instead of just pushing the opponent back, you could drive a spike right into their chest or face while remaining protected yourself. In close quarters, this was devastating. Imagine trying to get past a wall that hits back and pierces you at the same time. But it wasn't just about practicality, it was also psychological warfare. The mere sight of a spiked shield was enough to unnerve opponents. That's why it was banned in certain tournaments and cities. Authorities and knightly orders increasingly considered it dishonorable because it blurred the line between defense and blatant brutality. Yet, if the spiked shield spread pure close combat terror, the next weapon was designed to overwhelm and humiliate enemies. The Man-Catcher. Unlike the other weapons on this list, the Man-Catcher was not intended to kill, at least not directly. Instead, it was a long polearm with a forked, semicircular clamp at the end, often fitted with spikes on the inside. The idea was to grab someone by the neck or body, capture them, and immediately immobilize them. The Man-Catcher was particularly used for capturing high-value targets such as nobles or knights for ransom. But make no mistake, just because it wasn't meant to kill didn't mean it wasn't cruel. A well-aimed strike could break the neck, crush the windpipe, or pierce the skin as the spikes dug into the body. Even those who survived often carried severe and humiliating injuries. Eventually, it was considered dishonorable, especially in chivalric combat where facing an opponent face-to-face with a sword was preferred. Capturing someone with a Man-Catcher was considered sneaky and cowardly. Certain orders and fighting communities banned it completely, seeing it as a tool unworthy of a true warrior. But if you think that was brutal, wait until you hear about a weapon specifically designed to penetrate the finest armor of its time. The Bec de Corbin. The Bec de Corbin, or Raven's Beak, was a weapon with a single goal: to make plate armor ridiculous. It resembled a poleaxe, but the distinctive feature was the viciously curved spike on the back, resembling a raven's beak. On one side was a hammer for smashing, on the other, this deadly spike that could effortlessly punch through metal plates and destroy everything beneath. The armor was supposed to be the knight's ultimate protection. But with the Bec de Corbin, this defense became a death trap. The spike could pierce the joints and seams of the armor, making it not only ineffective but also dangerous for the wearer. A well-placed blow could break bones, tear organs, or bore deep into the body. Removal was almost impossible. This extreme brutality made the weapon controversial. In tournaments or ceremonial fights, which were about demonstrating skill and not causing fatal injuries, the Bec de Corbin was often banned. It was considered too destructive, too deadly for controlled environments. Knights didn't just want to win, they wanted to survive, and this weapon made that significantly less likely. Blade gauntlets. This is one of those weapons you don't usually associate with medieval peasants because, frankly, they should never have owned them. A blade gauntlet wasn't just armor for the hand, it was armor turned into a hidden weapon. Imagine a steel glove, but instead of just protecting your fingers, sharp blades or spikes were attached, ready to cut or pierce in close combat. It was deadly in a way that went beyond the battlefield. In the hands of a trained soldier, grappling with the opponent became a death sentence. That's why these weapons were strictly forbidden to peasants. Authorities could not afford common people possessing weapons that were discreet and deadly, especially at a time when control over the lower classes was paramount. But blade gauntlets were not rare just because of the ban. They were expensive, required the work of skilled smiths, and above all, they belonged to a type of warfare that peasants were never supposed to participate in: close combat in full armor with the precision of a trained killer. The Lantern Shield. Of all the weapons on this list, the Lantern Shield is probably the strangest. Yes, it was a shield, typically used in duels, but someone took this basic idea and turned it into a Swiss Army knife of violence. The Lantern Shield combined several tools into one deadly device. It had spikes, small blades, hooks for catching weapons, and most curiously, an actual lantern mounted on it. Why a lantern? Because this shield was not only intended for open battlefields. It was developed for nocturnal duels, street ambushes, and fights in dark alleys. The lantern could be used to blind or confuse the opponent in the dark, just the right moment for a fatal blow. But there was a sinister reason why this shield made the authorities nervous. It wasn't just knights using them. The fear grew that common people, especially peasants or townspeople, could adapt these weapons for nefarious purposes. Imagine someone working in the fields during the day, but roaming the back streets at night with a lantern shield ready to murder. Cities across Italy, especially Florence and Venice, recognized the danger of such a multi-purpose tool in civilian hands. Therefore, specific prohibitions were issued forbidding peasants and non-military personnel from possessing or manufacturing lantern shields. The risk of ambushes, murders, or political assassinations was simply too high. While this shield was a fusion of defense and attack, the next weapon was pure silence. No light, no sound, just a sudden end. The garrote. The garrote differed from all other weapons on the battlefield. It was not built to cut, stab, or smash. It served only one purpose: to kill silently. At its core, the garrote was a simple device, a cord, a piece of wire, sometimes a chain, but in the wrong hands it was deadly. The method was terrifyingly simple. One would sneak up on the target from behind, place the garrote around the neck, and pull tight. Within seconds, the victim lost consciousness. Pulling further could crush the windpipe, sever arteries, or even break the neck. Death was usually quick, but sometimes slow and agonizing, depending on the material and the killer's strength. Because of its stealth and efficiency, the garrote became the preferred tool of contract killers, spies, and those who wanted to eliminate their targets silently. That's precisely why it was banned for wartime use in so many European territories. The throwing star. We often associate throwing stars with Japan, but medieval Europe also had its version. Small sharpened steel tips that could be thrown inconspicuously. These weapons were meant to distract, injure, or incapacitate an opponent before they could react. European throwing stars may not have been as sophisticated as their Japanese counterparts, but they were still effective and deadly. Mercenaries used them not just to wound, but to incapacitate a guard, forcing him to drop his weapon or retreat, just enough time for a fatal blow or an escape. Due to their insidious and sneaky nature, these weapons were banned in several European cities. Knights and nobles considered them dishonorable, a tool for cowards who couldn't face their opponents directly. In some regions, simply possessing these stars could result in severe penalties, as they were closely linked to murder plots, espionage, and political assassinations. But while throwing stars worked from a distance, the poleaxe brought the fight directly to the closest range, and if it was heavy enough, it was too deadly even for the battlefield. The poleaxe. The poleaxe was already an impressive weapon. Part axe, part hammer, with a spike at the tip. It was designed to counteract the evolution of armor. A skilled fighter with a poleaxe could break bones, split helmets, and stab with precision, a versatile killer on the battlefield. Then came the heavy version, monstrous in size and weight, capable of delivering blows that could literally cut a man in half even with armor. These heavy poleaxes were not just overly brutal, they were designed to guarantee death with every blow. Their extreme lethality led to them being banned in knightly tournaments and controlled fighting arenas. In these settings, the aim was to test strength, skill, and honor. Knights didn't just want to win, they wanted their opponents to survive and be able to fight another time. With heavy poleaxes, that was barely possible. Therefore, many chivalric codes completely forbade their use in formal engagements. Handguns and early firearms. In the late Middle Ages, handguns and early firearms fundamentally changed warfare, but if you were a peasant, possession was illegal. In England, the 1514 Act concerning crossbows and handguns prohibited people from possessing firearms unless they owned land worth £100 per year, a real fortune at the time. The goal was to keep the true power in the hands of the wealthy. They didn't want peasants to have weapons that could compete with knights or threaten the social order. Now, from gunpowder back to something more primitive, but nonetheless deadly, the throwing spear. Throwing spears may seem simple, yet they were deadly and banned in many cities. As early as 1383, London completely banned them in public areas. The authorities feared that a peasant with a throwing spear could kill from a distance, making any uprising more dangerous. It wasn't just about peace, it was about control. And if spears were dangerous, polearms were an even greater threat. The halberd. The halberd was a brutal mix of spear, axe, and hook, perfect for combat but not for peasants. It was banned because a group of peasants with such weapons could easily take on knights. Cities enforced strict rules. Anyone possessing such a weapon without permission risked fines or worse. But some peasants didn't need polearms. They turned their own tools into weapons like the threshing flail. Hidden knives with long blades. Medieval authorities were particularly cautious about hidden weapons, especially long knives. In many cities, there were laws that not only restricted the blade length but also regulated whether they could be carried concealed under clothing. A peasant caught with a long, hidden knife faced harsh penalties because it suggested intent to kill or a planned ambush, not self-defense. These restrictions did not serve general protection. They were intended to keep violence controllable and visible. Concealed blades were for assassins, not for peasants, and if long knives were risky, imagine what the law thought about full-fledged daggers. Long daggers, music daggers were common, but the length was crucial. In several medieval cities, there were strict size restrictions for daggers. Anything too long was forbidden to peasants. The fear was that a long dagger could be used like a short sword, and that was reserved for knights or soldiers. These regulations ensured that peasants remained visibly unarmed or only carried simple tools. If you were caught with a long dagger in certain cities, it was considered not just a threat but a challenge to the social hierarchy. And those were the 20 most brutal weapons. What do you think? Which of these weapons do you think were too brutal? Write it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And feel free to check out our last videos. Thank you until next time.